You've got 10 million artisanal producers of impact around the world. And how do you match those 10 million producers with the hundreds of millions of people who want to be generous? And that is a very difficult sort of marketplace building, ecosystem building problem.
It's easy to say the nonprofit sector is broken. Less easy is saying how we're going to fix it. Welcome to What Donors Want, a podcast by IG Advisors, where we speak with brilliant people to reimagine the future of social impact. In this fourth season, we'll be switching things up a bit and diving into what we all want, including and beyond donors. I'm Rachel Stephenson-Sheff, IG's Managing Director, and we're a strategy consultancy specializing in social and environmental change. This podcast is part of our mission to fix the flow of resources for good.
Welcome back to What Donors Want. I'm Emily Collins-Ellis, IG Advisors CEO, and in today's episode, I was joined by our chair, Alisha Fernandez-Miranda, to speak to Piyush Tantia from Ideas42. Ideas42 are a nonprofit that specializes in behavioral science. They literally explore the data and research on what donors actually want, among other things. One of their recent behavioral science experiments was focused on our community platform for philanthropists, which is called the Mesa, alongside some other digital tools. So we loved hearing what had come out of that research. Lots of great learnings in this episode for anyone who is fundraising from or advising wealth holders, but also a lot to reflect on about how we make decisions as humans and what we need to take risks and be altruistic. I hope you find it as interesting as I did. Before we start, I want to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Siegel Family Foundation, who make it possible for us to have such fascinating conversations, and to our media partner, Alliance Magazine, who help us get the word out about what we learn. As always, you can get 50% off an Alliance subscription with the code WhatDonorsWant. Okay, here's the episode. I hope you enjoy.
Piyush, welcome to What Donors Want.
Thank you for having me.
I have been a fan of Ideas42 since I first saw you at the Gates Creator Giving Summit, which was, I want to say like 2018, maybe? Definite pre-COVID world. And just incredibly impressed with everything you do. We've been super lucky to be able to partner with you on this Made to Measure project. And we are just so delighted to have you here today to glean some of your insights around what donors actually want. And sometimes how what they say they want is different from what they want, because that's something that you do. So would love for you to kick us off by telling everybody who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Piyush Tantia. I'm a Chief Innovation Officer at Ideas42. I was the founding executive director. So Ideas42 is now a nonprofit that applies insights from behavioral science to improve lives and drive social change. We do this around the world. Over the years, we've done 600 or more innovation projects with 300 different partners around 55 countries. But we started out as a small lab at Harvard. And so I worked with the founding academics to then spin out of Harvard and build the nonprofit version of the place. And over the last, say, about 7 or 8 years, I've become obsessed with the charitable giving space and understanding the psychology of donors, and how the ecosystem works, and why there's so little infrastructure in it.
So what is it about this beautiful, brilliant space that we all work in that sort of initially attracted your attention? Was it the fact that there was just not a whole lot of infrastructure there? What really kind of started or kicked off this obsession?
I mean, what's interesting about giving is if you ask a rational economist, like, should people give? It makes no sense that people give and are generous. So from a psychology perspective, it's a very interesting behavior. It's something that you're just doing truly pro-social, right? You're just giving away your money. So that comes with just very interesting questions around how people make decisions about what they give to, how that feels. Maybe there's some parallels to buying luxury goods, because something that's not necessary but feels good, but still it's quite different. So that I think is interesting. The other aspect that was interesting is you've got 10 million artisanal producers of impact around the world. And how do you match those 10 million producers with the hundreds of millions of people who want to be generous? And that is a very difficult sort of marketplace building, ecosystem building problem. So you put that with the psychology, which is just a very rich area to go work in, also very nascent. A lot of startups, but nothing really established that exists. A small community of very cool, smart, interesting people who all want to do good and build new things. So all of that made it just a great space to work in.
I can really see in your eyes the kind of the curiosity and the excitement of a scientist that wants to kind of experiment in a fascinating new space in a new field. And I know that a lot of taking like scientific approaches to anything is really hoping to be surprised, right? Like looking at the data as much as you can and the different perspectives on it and hoping to find something new. And so given how long and how thoroughly you've been working in this space, what are the things that you are finding most surprising right now? What's standing out to you as kind of the newest and most exciting learnings that you're finding through your work?
So there's so many different directions I could go with that. So I think one is that when we started this work, it struck us how much of giving was just reactive. People were giving because someone was asking. And so we set out to figure out, well, what if we tried to change that? What if there were easier places to shop or easier places to go search for something to give to? Would that change that behavior? And it doesn't seem like it does. People say they want to give more, they want to be more strategic, they want to think about their giving more. We talk to lots of donors of different wealth levels over the years, but then they don't actually go and do that very proactively. So that remains an open question after all these years and so many efforts from so many people. Like, will that ever change? Will people ever attend to giving without somebody asking them? And maybe the shift we make is not each individual nonprofit asking donors over and over again, but platforms, giving platforms or intermediaries of different types asking donors and drawing their attention to giving. And that's important from a behavioral perspective, because we do find in the research that people choose very differently when they're making a choice about like one nonprofit in isolation versus choosing from amongst a set of nonprofits. Right? Once you're choosing from amongst a set of nonprofits, you can change how you present those choices and direct people to that smaller, lesser known one, or one that's working on systems change rather than direct services. That aspect has been interesting, is how do you get people to places where they can truly comparison shop, if you will.
I think there's been a lot made of this idea that giving has substantially changed since the pandemic. And one of the most interesting things about what you do is that you use behavioral psychology and randomized controlled trials to actually prove whether or not some of this is true. Have you seen that that is true or not, that giving has changed since 2020 and that period of time? I know it's not a huge amount of time since then, but have you noticed a shift in that period? Or do you think people are still behaving in the same way when it comes to giving?
We haven't, I can't say that we've done enough experiments before and after where we could track a trend like that. I would say, I don't know. Right? There does seem to be more giving happening in less formal ways. I mean, that's not from our data, but other folks have been tracking the way people are generous and mutual aid, and even thinking of like leaving a higher tip at a restaurant and feeling like giving. So it's possible that those sorts of things have changed. Yeah, so I don't know. I think some infrastructure did get built and tested because of COVID. So our entire project that we did together would not have come about if it wasn't for COVID. That all happened because donors started reaching out to the Gates Foundation asking about where they should give, where they could be most helpful at the beginning of the pandemic. So that's why the foundation then supported us testing these different approaches and solutions to help people find things. We don't have the so-called counterfactual, right? What if COVID had not happened? Would we have had fewer giving platforms? Would they have been smaller? Would there have been less investment in things like GoFundMe? Would it have grown less? I don't know. Hard to tell.
So you've had this kind of overarching learning agenda of looking into high net worth donor giving and then the kind of infrastructure for that. Can you speak a little bit to what you've found so far in that? And then obviously Alisha and I have been participants in some of that learning, as you say, so we can share some of our user experiences on the other side.
Yeah, I can talk about, so one big learning from this, when we started, especially when we started thinking about high net worth donors, that are wealthy donors or giving tens of thousands and up. We had thought of that as one sort of pool of folks. And then as we started doing the research, we realized that it splits into two very different groups by their context, by their situation, that there are a lot of wealthy folks who are giving hundreds of thousands a year, but they're doing it entirely on their own. They're not hiring any professional help, whether that be a consultant or advisor or permanent staff. And advisors have given me benchmarks that unless you're giving, over 1 million or over 5 million, it doesn't make sense for you to hire staff and consultants. So there is this group of people who actually are giving a lot. Right? To find places to give to, or you're trying to put $100,000 or $200,000 a year to work. That's quite hard. There's nothing available for them. They can vet a charity on GuideStar, and they can maybe look at some ratings on Charity Navigator. And other than that, they've got the internet. They can go search, they can talk to friends and family. So that group came up as a group that feels very underserved. And going forward, we're focusing on testing out new sort of solutions and products for that group. And we're doing that ideally in partnership with some national DAFs, donor advice funds. A bunch of that work is funded by the Fidelity Charitable Catalyst Fund, for which we're very thankful. So that was something new that came out. The rest of the group, the ultra high net worth and folks who are using advisors, we did a ton of research with advisors and philanthropy professionals because we realized that they are quite important. They're making a lot of the decisions in a way. They're influencing a lot of the decisions. They're doing a lot of the research. They all say that they want to do less work, to search and to create landscapes and strategies. But all the databases and kind of curated sources that exist today, they don't get used a lot. The advisors always say, oh, yeah, but I'm going to go vet that again. I need to vet that again. We always hear that. Everybody wants to do their own vetting. We started digging into that. And so we think there's this sort of need for something that feels comprehensive, but is also not as comprehensive as just everything and the whole internet or all information out there. But it can't be so vetted and curated that an expert feels like, well, someone just did my work for me, and I don't trust that. So there's some balance we have to strike where it feels like one-stop shopping, right? But it's exclusive to philanthropy professionals. So maybe it's like a multiple listing service for real estate. It's not the internet.
Like a right move, what we have in the UK. You can see all your properties.
You have, right. There are databases designed for professionals in various and sundry industries. And we think we need something like that for advisors. And it almost needs to be hard to use, that you need some expertise.
Well, do you know what's really interesting is that I think that one of the findings that you shared in a piece that we read was around, and in fact, this was in our Made to Measure report. So one of your kind of findings was that there's an infrastructure gap when it comes to, and I'm quoting you here, comprehensive, reliable, accessible information. Yeah. And I think that a lot of that information exists in different places, but for us as advisors at IG, because of course we do these bigger strategic projects, but we also advise individuals and families and foundations, and I don't know if it's just my age and I'm old school, like maybe Emily's going to like chime in and tell me I'm wrong. But to me, I need that personal, I almost need that personal due diligence. Like I need to know somebody who knew somebody, or I need to speak to somebody at the organization, or I need to find a connection that is giving me that extra level of confidence and security that goes beyond what I can read in financials and annual reports and all of that due diligence. So I can kind of relate to your gatekeepers essentially that you've been speaking to and what stops us. And I'm just trying to think of what would it have to look like for it to be enough? I don't know, Emily, do you agree with that or do you completely disagree with me?
I don't completely disagree, but I think it speaks to some interesting, not just generational differences in the way that we access and use information on anything, but also the economically irrational behavior that you were referencing before, right? If we compare this to a personal shopper helping you find a luxury item, of course they're never going to find you an item that you're going to take home and then it's going to break, or it's not going to be right for you, or it's going to clash with the colors in your house or whatever. There's going to be nuance and relationship building that goes into that decision, right? And so I don't know that directly applies to charitable giving. Of course, philanthropy always comes with risk. It always comes with needs that altruistic intention. The money is gone once it's gone. It's not the same as being able to take your, luxury vase back or whatever. But I do think that actually the extent to which we trust relationships, the opinions of our peers and our families and our trusted advisors versus, cold hard data that we're reviewing on any platform, no matter how accessible or easy that is to use. It's an interesting example of human behavior, whatever industry or sector you're doing it in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, Alisha. I think people always want that connection. And there's levels of this. So how do you narrow down to the handful of organizations that you're going to go visit and talk to and really build a relationship with? Even that first step, everyone tells us that they rely on trusted advisors. And are there other parts of our lives where we rely on maybe strangers for advice? Like we look at customer reviews now on everything. Yelp, Amazon, everywhere. These are strangers. Like maybe like Yelp has rated somebody an elite reviewer, or I start tracking some people somewhere. Or Quora has some people who give advice a lot. So could you build something like that in this space that's not entirely a person to person? I think you can, but peer groups matter a lot for this. The donor space, especially high net worth, they're not going to trust a review or recommendation from somebody who's not like them. And this came up in the work. This was one of the findings, the work we did on building these platforms. It's the one thing these donors wanted to do on these platforms was go and see who else is on there and learn more about their giving and how they're giving and how much and all of that. They didn't want to share their own information, but they wanted to see everyone else's. So I think we can build ways in which, there's been evergreen information like that, like reviews, references. Those references need not come just from donors. I mean, we've been kicking around this idea that we call community curation. And it turns out the Roddenberry Foundation has already done this at some scale with their Plus One Global Fund, where they're getting larger nonprofit leaders and other leaders in the social sector to recommend smaller organizations that have never had funding from the global north or anyone in the West. And that's a great way potentially to get that trusted recommendation while also lifting up organizations that just are not in those elite networks and wouldn't show up. Because maybe I've heard of the famous nonprofit leader that I admire. If that person is recommending a few organizations to me, I might trust that, even if I don't personally know that individual.
This podcast is made possible by Seagull Family Foundation. We are building an extensive network of extraordinary people, positively transforming lives and communities across Africa. Whether you're a dreamer, funder, leader, or visionary, our network can help you make the greatest impact. To learn more, visit www.seagullfamilyfoundation.org or contact us at info@seagullfamilyfoundation.org.
One of the kind of driving forces behind the work that we started doing in 2017 around developing community for high net worth individuals and philanthropists came from some of the things you're describing, where it's, the peer-to-peer trusted relationships, where it is that people turn to for this information and advice, and then acknowledging that actually the people who are already in their networks for them to turn to aren't necessarily serving them in the best way or giving them the best advice or leading them to the most kind of equitable decisions. And through our own research that we did way back then, what we found was that actually people were expressing a lot of loneliness with their experiences of philanthropy as well. So even though they might have had some people they could have turned to, they were finding that their immediate network that they could talk to about this stuff, or they were comfortable talking to about money stuff, or things that might have felt a bit show of wealthy, or some things that, bring different social forces in, that those people weren't necessarily able to give the philanthropy guidance that they wanted. Their service providers weren't able to give them the philanthropy advice that they wanted, and that they wanted to expand that circle of people that they felt they had that connection with and those relationships with, that they could then turn to for that advice. So our initial theory of change for the Mesa platform that we built was, how can we make international, global community around philanthropy more possible for people, so that it is a space where people can go, they can connect with others, they can build those relationships, they can ask their questions in a space of a community of people who they know are like them, they are experiencing some of the same challenges and have some of the same ambitions. So that was our kind of initial theory of change, right? It wasn't necessarily about trying to become a trust pilot or a right move of philanthropy. It was actually very much about enhancing that relationship-based aspect of how people seek out advice. And I know that the research that you did with us alongside another platform was kind of almost comparing and contrasting that community relationship approach with the kind of giving opportunities approach, right? Like how do you give people access to that kind of give list thing? And so I'm interested, what did you find around the key differences there? What worked, what didn't?
No, I think that theory of change still holds, right? Because we found that the thing people really wanted was that peer information. And if given that information, would they have connected with those peers more? We didn't really get to test that because we didn't go far enough. We didn't get enough sort of usage on the platforms yet. So I think that very much holds. Would that then lead to people wanting to search for new giving opportunities or even giving differently? No, I think that won't happen as quickly, because we also learned from the research that donors, especially who are further along in their giving journey, are not really changing who they're giving to all that often. That happens if more capital flows in, they increase their budget or their endowment, and then they're entering maybe new areas of giving or expanding. So these are fairly rare, infrequent moments when they might be doing that type of research. But they seem to always want to talk to peers and see what's happening and not feel lonely. Because another thing that came up from a lot of our interviews is there's a ton of public judgment that's legitimately happening, and then people are therefore afraid of that public judgment. Because especially the more creative you get with your giving and the bigger bets you make, we hear stories of peers saying, "Oh, why are you trying to change that school system? That's a waste of money. That'll never happen." These are terrible things to hear from your peers. These are not necessarily peers or sophisticated strategic philanthropists either, but these comments matter. So expanding networks so you're with people who are like-minded and are not going to limit you, especially when you're doing the right things. We should still keep that goal, and you should keep going with Mesa and build that. Right, and get people in. The negative thing that we learned, I suppose, and we should have known this going in, it's like, boy, it's hard to get people to use a new piece of technology. It just takes, if you think you need, X dollars for marketing and just efforts on outreach, you probably need 5X.
Yeah. I mean, I think another really big challenge for us, and we touched on this a little bit, because we started working on this in 2017 and we didn't know what the Mesa was going to look like. It wasn't even called the Mesa. We really just started with the design question. And I think in the years of doing this, we did find, and I'm sure, Emily, you will agree with me on this, a big difference between what we heard during the design stage, what we iterated and the feedback we got from that, and what actual usage was and how the platforms were actually being used. And I'm sure you find that with everything that you look at, essentially, that there's a big difference, particularly in such a niche community. There's not a ton of people that we're dealing with when we talk about scale here. It's very different from, looking at other kind of cohorts of givers where there might be more. I mean, how do you guys solve for that challenge of trying to really be able to pull out what it is that they actually want from their solutions, their platforms, their, all of that, versus what it is they say they want?
That's why we try to run experiments for everything. Because, yeah, you can learn something from asking people questions, but it's really hard to learn their preferences. And it's really hard for people to anticipate what their behavior will be in the future. What you can learn is what they've done before, what their situation is, what have they tried that worked, didn't work, what's been frustrating. And you can use those clues then to design along with what we know from the psychology research. So there may be some study in a lab that we run that gives us clues about, okay, how do we present information to nonprofits? Right. So, for example, we ran a lab study where we showed people a direct service organization, a systems change organization, and then a fund that pooled both of them together. So first we found, unsurprisingly, that people preferred the direct service organization. We'd heard this anecdotally, but we couldn't find any experimental evidence. So we generated that. But then we found that the fund does almost as well as the direct service organization. So if you bundle the systems change with the direct service, that works. Now we have this finding from subjects we recruited online. Does that translate to high net worth? We don't know, but at least we have some evidence that we can now go and design something in the field, because it's expensive to do that and it's expensive to run those tests in the field. But that's the only way to really know, will people use the thing? The other thing I would say is our mental models when we were building something like Mesa, it's too easy to start thinking about social media and the frequency of engagement that happens on social media. This will never be that.
Yeah.
Like, this is not the thing people are going to go and doom scroll on.
Even though we built in the doom scrolling algorithm.
Right, we built it, but no. This is more like a LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Or there used to be, I don't know if you have a UK equivalent of this, but there's a site here called Angie's List in the US for finding contractors and handymen, construction professionals, and so on. You go and use that like every 5 years when something breaks, you need someone to, fix your roof. It's trusted reviews. You pay a subscription for this thing. Right? The reviews from other people. Now, there isn't a social aspect to it like LinkedIn, but it's something you'll use infrequently, but it's still very valuable. And it's more about evergreen content than a feed of posts that are, very ephemeral in real time. And I think that model, that'll get used.
I find that really interesting because one thing that stood out from your report for me was the users that you interviewed said that they wanted to be content consumers, not creators.
Yeah.
So they were happy to be lurking, but not necessarily posting. And part of that was also that you said that they feared being judged or misunderstood. They didn't feel like they knew what was worth sharing or what was appropriate to share in the space. And I think that really gets to the heart of what the difference is in spaces that are about community, i.e. connecting with others, building relationships, being in community, that using that kind of human social stuff to kind of learn and shift your behaviors versus content feeds, which are a lot more about consumption, maybe interacting with or extracting information. And also a lot of the format of that we're used to, it triggers confirmation bias, tends to keep us stuck in our ways rather than influence behaviors necessarily. And I think we all feel like, not just philanthropists, we all feel that across the different platforms that we use in our digital lives. And so when it comes to user behavior in general, what do you think that digital community building, that kind of like using digital to influence behavior, what do we need to learn from that in order to make it more effective?
Pure information is very, very powerful. The finding around social norms and peer benchmarking from psychology over and over again that works. Keeping up with the Joneses. I tell you, people like you do X, you start doing. We've tried this energy conservation, water conservation, taking flu shots, so on and so forth, retirement savings, you name it, it tends to work in lots of different places. So just having that peer information somewhere for people to see gives us a tool to shift behavior. And it's not that, someone didn't have the intention to say change their strategy and be more strategic or make big bets. They have the intention, they want to do it. These are very smart people. But if you think that no one else is doing it, then you feel a little uncomfortable making that big bet. So if you could go to a place where you see, oh yeah, I'm not the only one doing this. There are lots of people doing it, and I can talk to them, and I can talk to them about their experiences, and I can see lots of stories of where a bet failed and a bet succeeded. And great, now I have a better sense for what actually my risk is. Like, is it a 1% chance this bet succeeds, or is it 10%? Like, people have no way of anchoring or judging any of this information. Because we also heard frustrations from donors and advisors both that experts come to them and pitch them completely contradictory strategies for the same social problem. And everyone claims their solution is the best. So how do you know? And sometimes it takes months of an advisor working on something to even unpack and understand exactly what the strategies are and what the differences are. So it's a difficult space to be making these risky decisions in. And that peer group, the peer information, I think, can give people more comfort with that, which is what we need. Another psychology I want to talk about, this also relates to something we were talking about earlier, is this is a very interesting piece of research that I found as I was digging into this. So it's called comparative ignorance. And this is research about how we think about risky bets. And it turns out that when you feel less competent in that area, then you become less likely to take that risky bet. But the way you judge your competence is relative to information that you're seeing around you. So if I start reading a lot of technical information and jargon that I don't understand, if I start talking to a lot of experts, compared to that, I start feeling less competent, even though I may know plenty. So in the high net worth donor space, all of our interviewees say, oh yeah, I want to learn more. I feel like I need to learn more before I make a decision. Why is this happening? Because we're throwing jargon at them. We're throwing experts at them constantly. So even though they've learned a lot and they know a lot about a space, they feel now, I think, less competent to make a decision because we've thrown all this jargon and expertise at them. Whereas we should do the opposite. And maybe, talking to peers who are not using jargon from the social sector will help with that.
That's so interesting because so often, of course, it's in the interest of nonprofits to make it clear how complicated what they're doing is, right? That it's the high value, that they're doing a lot of really complicated, important work. But I can see how in that situation that might actually make it less likely for a donor to take a big, or what they feel like is a big risk on funding something that they don't feel competent in.
I feel like this conversation has sparked so many ideas. I have like 6 projects I want to do now as a result
Yeah,
of
us
this.
too. We're
Oh my
in the
God.
same
I
boat.
have one I want to do with you. We're going to talk about that after this call. When you mentioned that the groups that you looked at split into 2, the group you didn't mention are people who have the means to give and haven't given it all yet.
Yeah.
And where do they fall in your research agenda? Are they a lost cause when you're like trying to build the plane and fly the plane at the same time? I think the analogy is, were they, and I know for our specific work, we were looking at groups of already, people who are already part of donor collectives. So they've put a stake down in the philanthropy world, but we know that there is a much larger group of people who have the means to give at significant levels and still don't. What do we do with those people?
In that group, I think there are some people where giving has just not bubbled up to something that's important to them yet. And that group is harder, and it's, I think, a waiting game, right? It is, after all, a personal choice. to what you want to do. And in some ways, it's like a hobby that you choose and how deep you want to get into it. But there are a lot of people who do want to give. And early in their journey, they get stuck. We did get to interview some people who were earlier in their journey, or at least were early enough so they could remember what it was like when they started. The unintuitive barriers that came up were just little bureaucratic details. Oh, I didn't know, my financial advisors didn't know what paperwork I needed to collect from the nonprofit for my taxes when I made a gift. Like, what were all the compliance requirements? I don't know. Oh, which financial vehicle should I use? Somebody was pitching me a remainder trust and someone else is pitching me a donor advised fund. These are all terms and financial products that nobody has ever heard of until they have an exit. And now they're on deadline to deal with that money because that tax benefit comes in that immediate moment, and you're getting thrown all these pitches and they all come with heavy fees. So this is the type of thing that was getting people derailed. That was pretty unintuitive. And the most visible analogs or beacons they have are the Gateses or the Gates Foundation. They see these large foundations, and that's not who they connect with. Like, well, I'm not Bill Gates. I'm not Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not going to set up a foundation with thousands of employees. So I don't know what to do. Like, who are the other people like me? So that's where a lot of people said they were getting stuck. Not so much the, figuring out what issue area and which nonprofits and so on. It was just all this logistic kind of thing. Like, what infrastructure do I need?
And from that, I can really see the potential power of not just being in a community where you can be nosy about other people and what they're doing and how they're doing it, but also the importance of sharing, I'm going to say normal, everyday, not Gatesian level philanthropy, where people can see what it actually looks like when you're doing it at the, either the everyday kind of household income level or the kind of, moderate wealth level, because it is happening at those levels. It's just hard to see the information about it and also understand how you've gotten there, right? That kind of competence thing can come in if you only see the shiny end product, which we're all familiar with on social media as well. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you spending this time with us. I'm going to ask everybody's favorite question once they've spent 30 minutes giving us all of their wisdom, which is, for our listeners, if you just could give them the most important takeaway from everything we've spoken about today, or everything that you kind of learned through your work, what is the one thing that you'd like them to kind of go away with and think about going forward?
I think I would say experimentation. Like, don't be afraid to try things and learn. And this goes both for our nonprofit listeners and donors who might be listening, because this is not a space that we know a lot about. These social problems are really, really hard and complex. It's not like we know exactly how to solve any of this. So the only way we can learn is try things, and we'll never reach perfection.
I love that. The spirit of the scientists.
Yes.
All right, we gotta go and start designing some of these projects we're gonna do.
Yeah, we're gonna start experimenting.
I've got to go experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you got to design a project.
Wonderful. Piyush, thank you so much. I have loved this conversation. The inner philanthropy geek in me is just like glowing. So
well, thank you for letting me geek out. This was super fun.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Piyush. Personally, I will be trying to do a much better job of not making people feel incompetent and therefore risk averse by using too much jargon about the work that we do. As always, we at IG would love to connect with you. You can find us on LinkedIn as IG Advisors. Our website is impactandgrowth.com. And if you're interested in joining our movement to change the philanthropic funding system for the better, you could apply for our Fix the Flow Fellowship at fixtheflow.org. One final shout out to our sponsor, Siegel Family Foundation, and also our media partner, Alliance Magazine, who are offering you 50% off a subscription with the code WhatDonorsWant. Thanks again for listening. See you soon.
This podcast was produced by me, Rachel Stephenson Sheff, and the team at Scrubcast. Shout out to Dave and Tim. Please rate, review, and subscribe if you can. It really helps us do what we do. Thanks so much.